So I think of myself broadly as an international trade economist. Within that field, I guess a lot of my work has been focused on aspects related to global production patterns, the role of multinational firms in laying out global value chains and sort of governing them. How I got to it it was a bit of an accident. I never intended to do international trade as a field of research. I was more interested in issues related to developing economies. I had some interest in macro, but I was taking a course in international trade and realized there were some aspects of multinational activity that I didn't think were well captured by available extant work, and that's how I got into it. There's not much more than that. So I've been concerned, and I continue to be concerned about the same topics. How do we get economies to grow, um, um, so that to lift people out of poverty, etc. And it is what happened was I realized that the international dimension of this problem was key. Multinationals played a key role in that. So that's obviously been something that has continued to fuel my research, trying to understand how the global economy works, how the gains from specialization are materialized, the gains that David Ricardo was talking about more than 200 years ago, but how they materialize in this modern world in which it's not countries trading with each other, it's more firms trading with each other, firms setting up this global value chains. So, I'm quite excited about it. I don't think we have definitive answers by any means. And that's really I don't think intellectually I've changed a lot in sort of my motivation. It's just I found an area that I thought was promising in sort of tackling this problem. It is very tempting to take what's happened since 2016 and say, well, this was just a fluke. There was some funny election in the US, and they elected an individual who is charismatic but has some crazy ideas, and now we find ourselves in this situation. It is tempting to think about this, that it's just an accident. But this is no accident. The US is a democracy. So that basically means that a non-trivial share of the things that President Trump said what he was going to do, people were wanted those things. They wanted protection. They wanted someone to stand their ground against China. And that hasn't gone away. This is in no small part why President Biden has changed a bit some policies, but hasn't really removed the tariffs that were put in place by the Trump administration. And this is why in the last election, President Trump won again. There is clearly enough discontent, at least in the US, with the global economy in recent years and how the US economy has coped with the Chinese one to continue to be this, that is going to continue to kind of leave these policies in place. It is not just a US thing. I mean, we've seen sort of many countries have been electing more and more inward-looking political parties. So there's a general sentiment in many parts of the globe that the globalization hasn't delivered what it promised to deliver. And I don't know I'm not so sure that's going to change anytime soon. I think that we're going to continue to be hit by technological shocks that are likely to have non-trivial impacts on the income distribution. And that's, again, going to generate tensions. Let me tell you what I learned maybe when working on these topics for about 25 years now, which is, I think, on the one hand, I think we have, as a field, a much better understanding that for some issues that may be relevant for the macroeconomy, thinking about them starting at a very microeconomic level and then aggregating it up to more macro aggregates, this is actually something that is a bit hard sometimes, but actually quite fruitful. Okay, so a lot of what I've been doing has been, starting with my PhD thesis, was to try to put myself in the shoes of a manager who's, you know, managing a company that might have demand for their products abroad, but is also thinking about ways to maximize profits by not just increasing sales, but maybe cutting costs. How would they do that? Thinking about how production processes look like. There's some that are very simple, like producing wine, but then you see an aircraft, and it's pretty obvious to anybody that producing an aircraft an airplane is a very complicated process that's going to go over many stages, many parts, components, and that, makes the problem of this manager of how do I produce this a much more complicated one. Also, from the point of view of managers, they don't know, just thinking about costs and markets where they sell goods, they think about the institutional environment. How secure are these transactions? Do I know if I transact with a supplier in China and I ask them to ship me a part of the plane, am I going to be happy when I get it? Is it going to malfunction? If it malfunctions and creates a big problem for the company, what's going to happen? May I find legal recourse and maybe be compensated? So I know if this incident, the airplane would be a disaster, but a smaller accident that might cost me, I estimate it's going to cost me 5 million euros. Can I take them to court and make sure that I'll get this so that I can more comfortably do business with them? This is, especially on the contractual side, as you know, that's what initially motivated me, because I think there was a lot to be done back then. There was not an awful lot of work on that in the field. But more broadly, this idea of, let's not just think about countries trading with each other. They do in aggregate statistics. They do in the work of David Ricardo in neoclassical theory. But in the world, it is firms. There are firms that are understanding there's demand for their products abroad, and they're venturing out into exports. It's firms that explain a lot on the import side, what gets into a country, which components are brought in from which countries into a country. It is firms that lay out global value chains, elite firms, multinational firms in particular. So that, I think, I've been motivated by this, and I was sort of keen to think about that from the firm perspective. But I want to think, and I do think that it's been a fruitful agenda, that I think there's a lot of non-trivial stuff we've learned from this that is that many people have found useful in their own work. Let me give you two answers here. On the first one, so you're asking me whether this gap, like moving from the micro level to the macro level. And the first answer I'd give you is I'm really interested in that for the same answer that I gave you at the very beginning, which is I didn't get into economics to understand what businessmen do. I think it's useful to know what they do, and I'm never going to get to understand fully what they do, but getting a sense of why they do what they do is helpful for my ultimate goal, which is to understand economic growth, aggregate performance, poverty, alleviation, etc. So I am deeply motivated by the macro phenomena. Having said this, both on the trade side, but also especially on the multinational side, we know that this is not a story of many, many, many firms doing idiosyncratic things, and then we're never going to get much from aggregating all this stuff. I mean, I talked about this yesterday, that if you just look at in the U.S. manufacturing sector, firms that do manufacturing in the U.S., those that are multinational account for only 1.5% of all firms. That is, there's about 250,000 firms in the U.S. doing manufacturing. Only about 3,600 of them are multinationals. Yet they account for more than 80 to 85% of U.S. imports and exports of those manufacturing firms. So, and that's in all sectors, right? If we then look at this sector, that sector, if you want to understand, give you an example, U.S. exports of aircraft, of airplanes. There's one company, right? probably, maybe I'm missing a smaller one, but if you understand what Boeing does, you're done. You've nailed that trade flow. And that's just an extreme example, obviously, but many sectors are really, most of the exports in those sectors are really coming from just a handful of companies. So understanding this decision at the firm level by itself, just you get a big share of trade. If you have a model where there's 3, 4 of these guys, yeah, that's it. Basically, not to diminish the importance of smaller companies. Obviously, they're important for many reasons, but in moving aggregates, these big guys, they explain a lot. So if, let me put it differently, if we have models that don't really map to what these firms do, it's hard to imagine that we're going to have models that provide reliable predictions. Yes, so I mean, as you mentioned, I did discuss a bit how the fact that multinationals are so very large is not particularly surprising if you can understand some of the key features that motivate their decisions, ranging from the type of technologies they operate. They feature high-scale economies, what we call high initial cost. Think about pharmaceutical companies. High initial cost, you need to be large to kind of be able to cover those costs. But globalization has given an extra fuel to their growth. And I think at some level it's not too surprising in the sense that, if you have a company that is selling some goods in a domestic market, there's only so many of these cars that they can sell to local consumers, right? Because they face competition from other companies, and then people don't want to have 3, 4 cars. But if you make investments that allow you to kind of sell to other countries, that's going to allow you to produce more and still place those goods in world markets. If you design a production process that not just uses local labor, but sources components from firms, suppliers in Eastern Europe, that's going to reduce your cost, and that's going to allow you to reduce prices, and maybe your demand's going to go up, and you're going to be selling more. If you become a multinational company and decide to not just export your goods, but you want to have a plant in North America, and maybe you have a plant in Asia, that again, it's going to allow you to sell your goods more cheaply because you're going to be closer to the consumers, and that's going to deliver more sales. Now, to achieve all this, this phenomena of like exporting, importing, or doing FDI, multinational activity, this is not something that all firms can do. It just takes some either highly productive production techniques, or it takes goods that are really very popular for you to kind of be able to what we call amortize those fixed costs of laying all that. But some firms that are inherently a bit better in terms of either productivity or in terms of product appeal, they've been able to make this happen. And that's led them to grow disproportionately more than firms that did not have the scale to make that happen and have remained domestic, inward-looking, non-FDI. And that's, I think, very important to understand. What people call the growth of superstar firms, I think in part has been shaped by this differential leveraging of the globalization forces. If you're in a world in which there's no transaction cost, to use Ronald Coase's term, that is that we have perfectly enforceable contracts. We don't worry what might happen because if there's a state of the world that concerns us, we can write down a contract that specifies exactly what we're going to do there. We know that in that world of what we call a world of complete contracts, which is we can write comprehensive contracts that don't leave anything out, and we have courts of law that we know can enforce those contracts. We know that firm boundaries don't matter. That is, you might say, there's no need to do things inside the firm, but you might as well do them inside the firm. It doesn't really matter. There's no distinction between the two. Once you depart from that, it's really subtle how the lack of enforceability, weaker enforcing, whether that's going to give you multinational firms or not, is not obvious. I'm going to just give you one precise example, which is, I think in many instances, some multinational firms might be choosing to rely on arm's length suppliers, independent suppliers, precisely because they know that's the best method to keep them motivated. You know, if they own their company and they do a good job, we sign a contract to sell at a price to, if they cut costs, they get that benefit because it's their company, they get the margin. If instead of doing that, it's an integrated company, then I have a manager, I could give him a bit of a commission, but it's not the same. They don't have as much what we call skin in the game. So there are reasons, for incentive reasons, sometimes you want to give up ownership. You want to just let them do their thing, reap the benefit of that, because that's going to come back to benefit you in terms of lower costs maybe, or eventually lower prices. And you haven't sort of killed that entrepreneurial spirit by integrating them. So that's one example in which you see there's no necessarily a positive or would you say a negative impact of contract enforcement on multinational activity. You know? So there, I think I always thought it's a bit more subtle how those things connect. And you're quite right that I don't think there's any evidence that multinational activity or the share of intra-firm trade in world trade, that's declining in recent years. I mean, I don't know if we need to think harder, but we certainly we care deeply about these questions, which is we know they're there, they're big, they're very powerful, and that, as I mentioned before, they're highly sophisticated, efficient companies, and for good reason. I told you that they got to where they are because they initially were already like better performers, but now they've sort of leveraged that higher efficiency or better products to kind of grow disproportionately more. And the question is, how should we feel about this? And if I may use the terms that I used yesterday in the presentation, I described it as the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? Just to kind of some old movie, spaghetti western with that title. And what do I mean by that? Well, I want to emphasize the good aspects of it. You might have concerns that multinational firms use their power, their size, to pay indecent wages or force their workers to work under conditions that we find unacceptable. And it's very easy to find examples where multinationals have misbehaved and they have caused severe accidents. But when economists or researchers have sort of scrutinized these companies without denying these particular instances, they found that consistently the wages paid by these companies, the working conditions offered by these companies are on average systematically much better, much higher than comparable firms in those countries. So we might have concerns about accidents and what happens, but if in a counterfactual world in which we pull those multinationals out of those countries, working conditions would be worse, wages would be lower. So that they get vilified, but they're a force for good in that sense. Obviously, as with trade, because they mediate so much trade, they generate so much trade, we know trade tends to increase income per capita. So I don't think that China would have grown half as much as it did had it not been for the fact that many US and Western European multinationals went there in the 90s, 80s and 90s, produced there, collaborated with suppliers, shared information that allowed China to grow, and by growing, lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. While diffusing technologies, same with Eastern Europe, it's been growing amazingly in no small part because of all these multinationals setting up shop there, sharing technologies, not just hiring people, but sharing technologies and creating a lot of improvements. So I think multinationals have been a force for good. There's no doubt about that. But there's the bad and the ugly. And with power, other things happen. So power, economic power often gives you political power in the sense that politicians might be particularly interested in hearing what you have to say. So I think there's a lot of evidence that big multinationals have wielded their power to try to affect the political process, regulation, the signing of certain agreements or not signing of certain agreements or clauses on agreements in ways that are beneficial to them. And they're profit maximizing entities. They are naturally kind of trying to kind of make sure that the contractual environment or protection of intellectual property is one that protects their interests. But I think policymakers, need to keep in mind that the interests of these companies are not always the socially desirable interests. And I'm not convinced that that this sort of wielding of power has always been a force for good. In some cases, it might have been a source for bad. In some cases, maybe good, but often bad. What's the ugly? Which is not just the wielding power to affect regulation or change laws, is that these large and sophisticated companies, sometimes they don't really abide by the law. Okay, there's a lot of at least anecdotal evidence, but it's quite convincing that many of these large multinationals are using the fact that they have operations in many countries, in countries that are often have different levels of corporate taxation, that they can use their multinational aspect and their sophistication, that is not just manufacturing sophistication, but in some cases is accounting sophistication, that minimize their tax burden in ways that are beneficial to their shareholders, but that are obviously detrimental to public finances that are deprived of some resources that when designing corporate taxation, a legislator thought that it's a good idea to do this. Okay, so that is ugly. Now we might want to rethink corporate taxation. We might think that multinationals are such a force for good that they should have a special tax treatment. Might have in my mind. I'm not saying that's the case, but it is ugly when things are done that appear to be outside the law. Well, I would even put it, I would even sort of reinforce what you just said, which is, yeah, on the bad side, maybe competition between lobbying is sort of, lobbyists is a good thing. It keeps things in check. That's certainly the Chicago backer view of things. I'm not sure that always works that way. There are sectors that are so concentrated that probably leads to inefficient regulation. But the competition side on the taxation part goes the other way, which is that because companies are competing with each other and they're trying to attract funding and please their shareholders, if some firms do it, the other firms feel like they need to do it as well. So the competition, as you kind of hinted, is not dealing with it. So what to do about it? I mean, there's two ways to go. One is tighter enforcement, and the other one is changing the rules of the game. So tighter enforcement is basically, if something seems to be pretty evident to folks that have written academic papers on the topics or that have sort of documented things that seem to be off, then it should be obvious to courts of law too. So maybe there's a hope that enforcement will lead to enforcement and penalties might lead to deterrence. Okay. But that might be not enough, or it might be hard to kind of enforce. So an alternative way is to kind of change the laws or change the rules of the game in ways that sort of eliminate this scope to shift the tax burden across countries. An obvious thing is what many countries have been pushing for, which is some minimum level of taxes, right? So if you know that your country cannot have less than a 15% corporate tax rate, that obviously is going to reduce the ability of these companies to kind of minimize the tax burden. And in principle, it should never be below 15%. So that would be one way to go. The problem is it takes two to tango, right? So I mean, you need coordination to do this. And we were able to coordinate on trade policy to avoid tariff wars, retaliation. Right after World War II, WTO, GATT, WTO were very successful with this, but that's not looking too nice now. We try to do this with climate change. We failed miserably. What makes us think that we're going to get this tax business done? I'm not entirely optimistic. So, but it needs to be done. I mean, I don't think it's as pressing or as crucial as the climate change problem, but it is a problem. It is a problem because it is affecting, tax revenue is dear to many governments, and it is also, it's ugly. It sort of doesn't help in sort of trying to make the case that these companies are forces of good, and that something needs to be done. I mean, it is a tough question for me because a lot of the answers I could give you, I don't know how I could base them on the sort of research that I've done or that I've read, that I've sort of absorbed. It's almost sort of a question about geopolitics. I mean, I know the effects of different arrangements, how they might shape the economy. But at the end of the day, the key choices that these countries are basically going to be facing is if our bigger brothers start fighting each other, what do we do? We don't have the parents to go to because there's no parents. The WTO is, they sadly passed away, if I can use these terms, that's a bit strong. But we don't want them to fight because we want to spend time with one, we want to then spend time with the other. We probably don't want to pick sides because the other one would be upset about it. So we need to kind of try to find this neutral stance where we continue to spend a few days a week with one of them, a few days a week with the other one, and hopefully in the background trying to kind of talk to them in a way that they're going to stop fighting with each other. That's a best case scenario. If you're talking about you're asking about specific policies, what would that mean? Well, I would sort of try to keep channels of communication and of trade open with various countries in the world. Obviously Switzerland has very deep ties with the European Union. They should not be discontinued at all and continue to foster cooperation. But if we get in a scenario where the European Union, which is going through very convoluted dynamics, starts taking a very aggressive stance towards China, towards the US, maybe it would be in Switzerland's interest to maybe not go along with that and sort of try to remain a bit more out of that and maintain ties and agreements with the US or foster further ones and sort of keep contacts with China, which I'm sure is still of an economy of great importance for Switzerland. Yeah, so I mean, we don't have tariffs on flows of intellectual property, so you're a bit more shielded. But the return to those innovations would be affected by trade wars, right? So it's true that maybe the type of Switzerland as an origin for goods, or these bilateral agreements are less necessary, but still this idea of let's try to kind of make sure that our brothers they go back to talking to each other because those fights are going to feed back into how productive that innovation is going to be. There's also, in some sectors, you might be concerned about the spatial separation between research and production, that this is something that maybe it's not as simple as saying, okay, let's just do R&D. We don't need manufacturing because there's a lot of need for R&D worldwide, and we have a very skilled labor force that can provide it. And maybe for, yesterday we had some folks from the pharma industry, maybe for that industry, it is the R&D is so scientific, right, that it doesn't really need to kind of interact with manufacturing an awful lot. There's not much the scientists would learn about drugs in seeing how they're produced. But in many other sectors, like in car production, other types of manufacturing, R&D is much more tied to the production process. So the spatial separation between innovation and manufacturing could end up eroding Switzerland's comparative advantage in R&D in some types of manufacturing processes. Maybe not pharmaceuticals, which is obviously of great importance to this country, but in other sectors, that might be a bigger issue.